folks. It's Thursday, 24th of April 2025, and welcome to Tinfoil News. There is a few things that we need to get through today. There's some crazy stuff happening in the world, and so what should we start with first? Um, let's start with what's going on in India and Kashmir specifically. So it seems that yesterday there was a terrorist attack in Kashmir. It seems like 27 people have died, and it was on in the Kashmir side of so the kind of demilitarized zone or essentially area between kind of India and Pakistan. This is has been a contested area for a long time. Both sides have said they want to take control of it for various different historical reasons. They both think it's part of their essentially their territory. And it's been simmering away for quite some time, and it flares up every now and then. And this is a problem for the West essentially, and certainly in the East and in the location where they are, mainly because they're two nuclear powers. And they're right next door to each other. And they have a history of lobbing shells over the border and stuff like that from time to time. There's skirmishes at the borders and stuff like that every now and then. It had seemed that it'd settled down for a while, but it does seem like it's starting to ramp up again, which is interesting because the world seems to be in a state of flux where lots of things seem to be ramping up. We've got what's going on in Ukraine, we've got what's going on in Israel and Syria. Well, Syria is kind of done, to be fair, um, and also with what's going on in Yemen and Iran and that part of the world as well. So there are definitely some conflict zones that are happening just now. Um, and it seems that seems to be kind of percolating out the way. We've also got that simmering tension between what's going on with China and Taiwan, and that's an interesting one as well because as far as China is concerned, Taiwan has never been anything other than a part of China. Taiwan declared its independence many years ago, so that looks like it has some simmering tensions as well, and it's problematic in these areas about who supports who gets support from which entities essentially. So going back to what's happening between India and Pakistan in the Kashmir region, it looks and there are early indications that this was one of the terrorist groups affiliated to a Pakistani terrorist group. I'm not going to try and pronounce the names, but ultimately you can look it up for yourselves. Go have a look at India, Pakistan, Kashmir, and whatnot. But obviously, the Pakistani government are saying nothing to do with us. The terrorist groups themselves are quiet for the moment, but it does seem that there's a potential flare up that could occur in that region, and as I say, that's a problem because both sides have nuclear weapons, and they really don't like each other that much at all. It's been one of these kind of simmering tension things for quite a long time now. And so yes, keep an eye on that one and see how that develops. Closer to home, we have what happened yesterday. I mentioned yesterday that we were looking at a meeting in London where Ukraine was going to be present, where London was going to, where the UK was going to be hosting essentially. France was going to be present, America was going to come, and I think Germany was due to come as well. And I'd said yesterday that we might have like a fast moving political landscape, and indeed that turned out to be the case. We had a situation yesterday where pretty much as soon as I posted my video to say this is what potentially could come out today, this have a look at for how important this could be because this could set the tone and the roadmap on a path to peace. And no sooner had I done that than Zelensky basically blew up the deal, and that's basically what happened. We can go into the nuts and bolts of how that occurred, but it seems that even before, like, so the day on the night before, I should say, of the actual London meeting, so on the night of the 22nd of this month, Zelensky was already making sounds that he wasn't going to come. He wasn't the people that were going to be going to the deal didn't have any remit to talk about Kellogg's plan, and certainly not about the territorial integrity of Ukraine, which kind of made the whole meeting pointless, essentially. So we get to a situation yesterday morning where I make my little news roundup, as it were. Before, as I'm posting it, it's already out of date, which is how quickly these things move sometimes. So what did happen? Why did it get done? Why did Zelensky blow up the deal? And I should say at this point, it was really interesting watching the British media then kind of, I suppose, spin that to be something other than it was. One of the spin moments that I saw was that the talks got put on hold because the Russians had suggested that they might agree to some sort of deal about returning land for X, Y, and Z and all this kind of stuff, which is complete nonsense. The Russians never agreed to anything. The format that was supposed to happen yesterday was that Yermak, I think that's Zelensky's foreign minister, I believe, was due to come into London, and he was going to discuss Kellogg's peace plan as presented by the Americans to the Ukrainians, the British, the French, and the Germans, basically, and they each had representatives from all of those countries. But before that even happened, Zelensky started saying, "We're not going to agree to any kind of territorial concessions. The territorial integrity of Ukraine is not up for discussion." So, and just to recap, obviously, Russia and Ukraine have obviously been fighting for the last 3 years or so, and Russia has taken over certain parts of certain regions within Ukraine, but they've held on to Crimea since 2014, which is when the hot phase of this war really started. So, Crimea, Zaporozhye, parts of Kherson, Donetsk and Lugansk are the areas that Russia basically said that's ours. We've taken over them, so they are officially ours, and they voted to be part of Russia now, um, which is an interesting move on Russia's part when it happened a year or 2 years ago. Um, so that was them setting up their stall, saying this is ours now. It's not Ukraine's, and Ukraine's are obviously saying, well, no, that's actually that's our land. You can't just come in and take something by force. Really interesting to see. I think it was I can't remember which British minister said it, but essentially someone said we can't agree to this as the UK, that we can't give those territorial concessions to Russia as part of this deal, because then we're setting a precedent for changing borders by force, which is really interesting because the Americans did that in Syria. Just saying, the Americans essentially annexed part of eastern Syria quite a number of years ago, which is the oil bearing part of Syria. And they did that from northern Iraq. And they took over all the oil fields, and they put an illegal American base into Syria, which was staffed, depending on whose numbers you believe, somewhere between 500 service people to 2,000 service people. So quite a sizable base to protect the annexation of those oil fields in eastern Syria. So I think it's a bit hypocritical for someone to say you can't change borders by force. Similarly, you also have Britain providing overflight and essential reconnaissance information to Israel from Akrotiri in Cyprus. So we fly overflights over Israel at their with their blessing, essentially, um, and provide them real time data. And this is well known. You can go look this up. Um, so we provide this reconnaissance information, and Israel is basically changing the borders of Gaza, which that's being done by force. So apparently, we don't support changing borders by force in Ukraine, but we do in Gaza or Syria. That's okay. So just saying, there seems to be a bit of hypocrisy certainly in the UK stance, and to a degree in other people's stance as well. I get why it happens. It's we've got a vested interest in certain places, and that's why we project our objectives into those places. But the hypocrisy of what comes out in the media is quite apparent for all to see. So so going back to the proposed meeting in London, which was supposed to take place yesterday, Zelensky essentially blew it up on the night before by saying we're not sending people to actually negotiate. any kind of territorial concessions. We're not going to negotiate the Kellogg plan. We're going to go. We can send people, but they're going to go for our maximalist objectives, which is the return of all territories, and Russia has to go back to its own borders, and then there'll be. Then we need to get to the weeds of who pays what to who for reparations and who goes to court for what war crimes and all that kind of good stuff. At which point the Americans said, "Nope, we're not sending anyone. Marco Rubio's not. He's not going to get on the plane. Then there's no point in him getting on the plane." And then we end up in a situation on Monday morning where the Americans haven't arrived and they're not coming. Yermak, I think from Ukraine had arrived. I think the delegations from France and Germany had arrived as well. And then it all fell apart very, very quickly because what's the point in hold? Oh yeah, sorry. One thing I should mention as well: the Americans supposedly had a line into the Russians, so not into the actual room where the meeting was going to be held, but in another room, the Russians were going to have a direct line into the Americans, so they get real-time updates on what was going on in the meeting, and that meant that there would be no surprises, so that they could essentially put their point into the meeting, without them being present, which is kind of standard mediation tactics, to be honest. So yeah, we end up in this situation where everything falls apart, and everything gets put on pause, and now we're in this situation where everyone's starting to blame, start to point fingers at each other and say it's your fault, it's your fault. Amazingly, apparently it's going to be the Russians' fault. With they weren't even present, but that's our standard spin tactic, shall we say? And then on top of that, then we've got Russia actually continuing with its ongoing offensive. Now, one of the things that's really, really important to mention about what goes on in Ukraine and how the offensives works, and this is something that a lot of people don't seem to really understand, is actually how the ground in Ukraine is unique. Essentially, it's very deep, rich, fertile soil, and a lot of grains obviously come from there. Um, and there's a lot of rare earth minerals. But one thing that most people don't seem to understand is how difficult it is to actually fight in Ukraine during what's known as the Rasputitsa. Um, and for your information, Rasputitsa is a period of time every year where it rains a lot. And it does that obviously, from I suppose from kind of February time through to April, and it does that also kind of I suppose kind of October into November as well. Now, what's happening is that essentially, if you go from because Ukraine gets very, very cold during the winter. I mean, we get down to like some serious minus numbers, so the ground freezes, and then obviously it warms up. And so you have a period where the ground itself just turns into utter slush, essentially, and you can't move heavy vehicles through that type of ground because this earth is something like 5 to 10 meters thick. I mean, it's enormously rich and enormously deep, so it just turns into this absolute quagmire. So like for essentially 4 months out of 12 months, it's really difficult to move heavy weaponry or artillery or whatever, or tanks certainly as well. And so that makes it really difficult to execute obviously offensive operations for the period of time where the ground starts unfreezing and turns into this slushy things before it hardens up as the heat gets in and it goes into proper summer. So you end up with like there's certain months that you can execute your offensives in. So there's always a summer offensive, and that's what the Russians have done. Now the feeling this year is that the Ukrainians are really struggling with recruiting enough people to cover the losses that they're experiencing on the battlefield, and that the Russians aren't experiencing the same problems recruiting enough people, allegedly. And this has been borne out by some information that's been given by notably Russian sources. Um, but they were saying earlier in the war, like 2022 into 2023, they were recruiting about 1,500 people a day. That number now is about 1,000 people a day. Somewhere between 1,000 to 1,200 people a day, depending on which sources you kind of believe. Ukraine is getting nowhere near that. They go through these recruitment drives, and they've gone through essentially most of their population. Women haven't been drafted yet, and it seems that it's voluntary to be drafted between the ages of 18 to 25. But these are the last cohorts of the population that you can realistically draft into your armies. Um, and if we start seeing that the 18 to 25-year-old cohort is starting to be drafted into the Ukrainian army, you know that they're really struggling because there's only so many hundreds of thousands of those people. I think where I think the comparative sizes of the armies, the way it works out. So say we'll just pick a number, right? Say it's 500,000 each. It's roughly about right. So say Ukrainians have an army of 500,000 and the Russians have an army of 500,000. What's been happening is that initially at the start of the war, the Ukrainians had more personnel than Russia went in with. I think Russia went in with something like 190,000 people, of which about 80 to 90,000 were combat troops. So quite a small number, to take over a country, which is what was promoted in the press at the time. They were never to they were never designed to go in and take over a country. They were designed to go in and get to Kiev and force them to stop being arseholes in their in their opinion, basically. And you can believe it or not, but ultimately, what had happened since 2014 is that there had been skirmishes between the little green men of Russia in the Donbass region, or the militia groups, whatever you want to call them, and the Ukrainians themselves. And it's well noted that during that kind of 8 year period, the Ukrainians killed 14,000 of their own people, and during shelling activity, and they shelled the next city pretty much daily. Um, which is kind of one of the drivers for the conflict. Ultimately, is that they kept on shelling cities, civilians, and they were killing civilians. And this is something that goes really, really underreported in the Western media, especially when we've got such a Russia bad focus in our media. And I'm not saying that the Russians don't kill civilians; they absolutely do. They're civilians sadly get caught in crossfires. Missiles go, of course. Things that I don't believe that they're targeting civilians specifically because that doesn't make military sense to do that. If they were going to target civilians, they'd go for like a blanket kind of like World War II bombing type campaign where they would just level entire cities. And that's not what they tried to do. What they tried to do is, they go after the military objects. Sadly, sometimes those military objects are right next to or in civilian centres, and so you're going to end up with civilian casualties. It's just going to happen. Now, both the Russians and Ukrainians do this, so one's no better than the other, in my opinion. Anyways, so going back to where we were with the Rasputita and how the war is executed, we have these offensives that have to occur during the summer or have to occur in the winter. And it's much harder to execute an offensive during the winter than it is the summer for obvious reasons. It's very very cold, so it's harder to move around. Well, people don't want to. Why would you? But during the summer, you have it's much easier to execute these offensives. Now, where we are, and I was mentioning about the respective sizes of the forces and saying it's roughly about 500,000 each. It's roughly about the same. But what's been happening is that actually the Ukrainian army kind of got bigger and bigger and bigger during the 22-23 phase of the war, and Russia didn't match it as quickly. Basically, it took them longer to get up to force matching the Ukrainians, but they did, and essentially they've been kind of locking horns, and it's been an attritional war for quite a number of years. But an attritional war where the Russians keep inching forward, basically, there were some setbacks for the Russians, 100%, and there have been some setbacks for the Ukrainians too. So but the problem is that the force match is really starting to become unequal now. So it's not 500,000 each anymore. It's more equivalent to say 350,000 versus 600,000. So that's it, and the 600,000 keeps growing, and the 350,000 keeps shrinking, basically. So we're getting to a point where Russia are getting a lot stronger. And basic military tactics. And this is something that I've studied in my spare time. I've always been fascinated by conflict and what happens, and I've always been fascinated by not just the conflicts themselves, because I suppose that's a little depressing in its own way, but I've actually I'm really interested in how the tactics of battles are executed, and I'm much more interested in the politics and the propaganda that surrounds it, and what is said to various people to get them to think certain ways, basically. And that's really important to me because I like to know I, for my own peace of mind, I like to know when someone's trying to manipulate me, or the media or the government or whatever are trying to manipulate my thinking. And they're trying to do that all the time. And I think every government in the world and every media station in the world does that. Basically, that's standard. But I like to know what the tropes are, what the and spot them for what they are, basically. And I like to know that from both sides because it to me, as I say, it's quite interesting. So where we've got to is this place where sorry, I should go back to basic military doctrine. So if you're going to attack someone, basic military doctrine is that you need a 3-to-1 advantage. And to be successful, you generally need a 3-to-1 advantage. You can succeed with a much lesser force match than that, but ultimately, if you really want to be certain that you're going to prevail, you want a 3-to-1 advantage. And we're certainly getting towards a 2-to-1 advantage for the Russians to the Ukrainian armed forces now. We're very much heading in that direction. It seems, I think it was General Siersky just like a couple of weeks ago, essentially said that he needed 30,000 fresh recruits every month. And that's not now you can do a back of the envelope type calculation to work out, are they actually losing 30,000 a month? And the answer is probably no. They probably realize that the Russian army is growing in numbers. They are certainly adding 30,000 a month to their ranks, which translates to quite a big. The force matches, as I say, is really starting to tell the difference. So what the thinking is right now is that because the Russians are starting to have this complete uh, overmatch, I think is the word actually. There's a disparity between the two fighting forces. It's going to start telling quite quickly now. We've had this place where the two forces were quite similar and they've been battering against each other, but now one force is really starting to has been attrited. If that's the word, I think that's the word. Has been attrited so much that the other force is now going to start rolling over them, and I think we're starting to see the early signs of that in the offensives that are happening. It looks like um, the Russians are on the front foot in most cases across the entire contact line, and they are certainly developing. They the other thing as well is that there's at least 200,000 to 300,000 Russian soldiers in reserve. So you've got this situation right now where they are being rotated in and out for rest and recuperation, as you would expect for folks on the front line, whereas the Ukrainians aren't. Not in the same way, and certainly not in the same timeline. So they're getting exhausted, and that's a problem for the Ukrainian army. Is that at some point you get too exhausted and everyone it just collapses. Now there was a feeling that last year that by August, September, October last year, the the amount of recruits that Ukrainian was taking in was becoming exhausted at that point, and they were going to have some serious manpower issues. And it looks like it's developing onto the battlefield, and it looks like it will develop onto the battlefield this particular summer. We'll see how that goes. Um, it's one of these things where I mean personally, from a personal point of view, I'd rather they get a peace deal done and everyone's happy. But it's the two sides are not talking the right language to each other at the moment. And with Zelensky blowing up the deal yesterday morning, it doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. So it seems that the Russians and Americans are roughly on the same page for trying to talk to each other and get to the end of the war. It seems like the Europeans and Zelensky are on a completely different page and want to continue the war. The problem, as I see it, is that I think by the end of April that'll be Trump's 100 days, which is when he said he would have this war. He would have a ceasefire in place that would be done. I know that certainly his election campaign, he was saying he could do it within 24 hours. I think they realised fairly quickly that this is a lot more complex than being able to pick up a phone and sort out a deal in 24 hours. There's a lot of bad blood here. There's a lot of complexity to each side's objectives. So we've got a situation where obviously Zelensky's blown up the deal, and it doesn't look like anything's going to happen anytime soon. My feeling is that what will happen next is that we'll have a situation where Trump will walk away, and I think we've got 6 days, maybe less than a week, before they decide. Now we've got no skin in the game here. We don't want to be part of this game anymore. And that's very obvious because like America is really starting to turn it wants to turn its attention to the Middle East. It wants to focus on Yemen and Iran. It's certainly been sending armaments that way. It cannot fight a war on two fronts essentially, and that's what's happening right now. Is that you've got a military buildup in the uh, it's not the Red Sea, but certainly like the Arabian Gulf and around that part of the world, because Trump looks like he wants to do something with Yemen, and it might be with Israel. When I say do something with Yemen, I mean he might be sending in troops. He might. I mean, they're conducting an airborne war at the moment. Um, there's daily reports of, certainly from Yemeni media, about them shooting down various Reaper drones and stuff like that. That they've been targeting this ship and that ship and stuff. And certainly they've been, relatively successfully targeting some ships. I think they've also targeted the carriers. There's two carrier groups, as far as I understand. They have targeted the carriers. It's unclear as to whether they've been successful in getting through just yet. I'm not sure we'd hear about it if they did. Um, although I'm actually, to be fair, thinking about it, if the Houthis managed to land a ballistic missile on one of the carriers, I'm pretty sure they'd be jumping up and down and crowing to the world that they'd done it. We haven't seen that yet. And certainly the talks with Iran via mediators and intermediaries are ongoing about their nuclear program. Essentially, for me though, that nuclear program, it should be a really simple thing. It's a case of Iran. You can't. The conversation seems really simple to me. It should be very easy. It should be quite an easy deal, in the sense of Iran has already agreed to get to not enrich its uranium beyond 60%. It's agreed to, as far as I understand, it's agreed for Russia to oversee that. Um, and at the moment, we're still having these conversations. So this should be a done deal, as far as I'm concerned. Why it's not a done deal makes me wonder whether there's other things on the go here, and whether America and Israel and such like are actually using this as a smokescreen, and it's just to kind of move the assets into place, and it's just to buy time so they can actually go ahead and attack Iran. So those are so that's Kashmir. That's what's happening in Ukraine. I think, there's one more thing I want to mention about Ukraine, and it's very much to do with so there were some attacks on Kiev last night. And as always, there's so many missiles and so many drones and such like. There have been a number of attacks recently in Ukraine. This is something that's not really well reported in Western media at all. Is the number of NATO officers that are being killed right now? Now we will never get this information. We only get this information from neutral and pro-Russian sources. So you can go have a look for it for yourself. I'm not saying this information is valid or accurate, but what we're seeing, we're certainly seeing elements where trainers, which you can probably is another synonym for NATO advisors. So there were a lot of trainers that were killed in, I think it was in Kryvyi Rih or Dnipro. That was a few months back. There's certainly they went after French and UK officers in Odessa. That definitely happened. There's a recent thing that happened in Sumy, where there was a lot of people killed and a lot of people injured. The Russians and their sources are saying that was a meeting of Western officers to talk about the defense in the Sumy region. Um, it seems to me that, and also, we're basing this on the recent New York Times article, where the war is being conducted out of Wiesbaden in Germany, and so it's not a big leap to for the Western officers, and there'll be Polish, and there'll be Romanian, and there'll be British, and there'll be French, and there'll be all and potentially German as well. So all of these NATO people are based in various parts of Ukraine, and they are advising on the execution of various upcoming battles and whatnot, and what to do in the defense, etc., etc. It seems like Russia is definitely targeting them now. I think the gloves are off, and I think that the gloves are off because you've got Starmer and Macron openly advocating for troops to go in, and you've got Friedrich Merz openly advocating for Taurus missiles to be used to be launched or to be given to Ukraine to then be launched at Russia. And here it's really, really important to note that things like the Scalp missile, the Storm Shadow missile, and the Taurus missile, they cannot be operated by Ukrainian military. They need technical input. So technicians, so that would be British, French, German technicians, need to input the coordinates and everything like that, and all the right targeting information. They need to prepare these missiles prior to being put into whatever launch vehicle it is, whether it's on a plane or whatever. So once it's on the plane, that becomes a Ukrainian missile. But the point is that the targeting information, all the preparation, all the rest of it is done by European technicians. So Ukraine don't have the technology. They don't have the wherewithal to be able to do this themselves, um, because they can't. They don't have the satellites. They don't have the missiles, and so and it's not to say Ukrainians are stupid. They're far from it. They're very, very clever people. Um, it's just that this is proprietary technology. You do not share this knowledge with people that could potentially be your enemies in the future. So you do it yourself and then you hand it to them. That's the way this works. So anytime you hear about a Storm Shadow being launched, or a Scout missile being launched, or potentially a Taurus missile being launched, then that cannot be done without European input. And that means that technically we are attacking Russia, which is an insanely dangerous proposition from our part, because they would be quite within their rights to launch a missile and take out one of our boats or whatever, or one of our military installations on our soil, because we have attacked them on their soil. So this is why I get a bit like, why are we doing this? Why are we pushing this so hard? And it's the one thing that I personally don't understand, is why we're poking the bear, as it were. Why do we continue to do this? Because what we're essentially relying on is someone else showing restraint, not us showing restraint. We continually keep poking, and they keep continually taking. And I don't think it's weak. I don't think it's because they're weak. I think it's because they know that if they attack us, then the gloves come off and it all goes nuclear very, very quickly. So I imagine that they're probably looking for hybrid ways to deal with France and the UK. And I think we're going to see potentially things being sabotaged in this country. And it might be, I my personal one is because I work in the energy industry. If you think about like the oil rigs or the pipelines and stuff like that offshore, not saying that they're easy targets, but that might be the direction they go in. And if that happens, then us as a country are going to be in really, really deep war very, very quickly, because the lights could go out. That's the point I'm trying to make. We have a very, very narrow band of energy security in this country. We offshore in the UK, I think we produce something like 60% of our needs, maybe 65% of our actual needs. So if that gets hurt at all, I'm not convinced that we have the infrastructure to import all of the electricity or the energy that we need. Um, as a for instance, you could maybe say, oh, we could turn to nuclear energy, and that could potentially provide what we need. Well, we're shutting down nuclear stations in the UK now. Hunterston B in the UK, which is in the west of Scotland. So that has essentially been defueled now. That's it. It's done. Finished. And we've got various different nuclear power stations. We've got in the UK, some in Scotland, some in England, some being built as we speak, basically. But they certainly wouldn't be able to provide the load that would be needed for the nation. So, yeah, these are the kind of things that give me pause for thought as to why we continually keep poking someone, and they could respond. And it could be a case of like, so if you go back and remember in the early stages of the war, and I'm sorry, this is a really interesting fact actually. Even before the special military conflict, or special military operation, as the Russians called it, between Russia and Ukraine had started, Joe Biden was actively going around saying he was going to stop the Nord Stream pipelines. Now, for your information, the Nord Stream pipelines were gas pipelines that were built from essentially from Russia into Denmark and northern Germany. And that was to get Russian gas from various fields to much more easily to Europe, essentially. Um, and one of the really interesting things was that the Americans absolutely hated this. Now you can put your tinfoil hat on and wonder whether what conspiracy is on the go here, but ultimately, what are the tangible benefits to America of Ukraine and Russia getting into conflict? Well, one of the tangible benefits to them is that the Russian gas essentially got turned off to Europe, which meant that Europe needed to get its energy from somewhere else. And lo and behold, the Americans turned up with LNG from over in America, which is more expensive. It's ended up with Germany essentially going into recession. And the only way it's going to get out of it is apparently by taking off its debt brake and building more armaments. Now, I'm not saying that that's not a good way of dealing with the situation. All I'm saying is every time Germany rearms, it doesn't end well. So there's some food for thought. Anyway, I think we'll end it here. There's a lot more that I could bang on about, but we'll see how today's politics go, and I'll update you tomorrow. But in the meantime, take care. Have a good day.